everybody. I hope that you're well, and I also hope that you are having a good day so far. Today, we'll be doing our grade 6 English lesson on simple, compound, and complex sentences. And before we start, we're going to log on to aplusstudents.ca. Once you've logged on to aplusstudents.ca with our username as well as our password, and then we're going to select the subject of English Language Arts. Grade 6. And then we're going to scroll down up until we get to our chapter of simple, compound, and complex sentences. So, simple, compound, and complex sentences. All right, so we said our chapter is simple, compound, and complex sentences. Our subject is English Language Arts. We're doing grade 6. And the lessons that we are going to be focusing on under the chapter of simple, compound, and complex sentences, it's to identify dependent and independent clauses, and it is the sentence simple, compound, or complex. We need to say if the sentence is simple, compound, or complex. So that is going to be the lessons for today under our chapter of simple, compound, and complex sentences. All right. So before we go on to what a simple sentence is, what a compound sentence is, or what a complex sentence is, we're going to make mention of a clause, right? And a clause it is a group of words that contains both subject and it contains a predicate. That's a clause. It's a group of words that contains both subject and it contains a predicate. And when it comes to our clauses, right, we have independent clauses and then we also have a dependent clause. And an independent clause, it basically is a complete thought. That's an independent clause. It is a complete thought. And when we say it is a complete thought, then it means that it has both subject and it has a predicate. It expresses a complete thought. It has a subject and it has a predicate. So almost like saying it tells us who or what we are talking about and the action that that person or thing is doing. And when once again, if we talk about an independent clause, right, then an independent clause, it can stand alone. It can stand on its own as a sentence because it has both subject and it has a predicate. So it can stand alone as a sentence. That's an independent clause. And then we have a dependent clause, right? And a dependent clause cannot stand on its own as a sentence. It cannot stand alone as a sentence. It needs an independent clause in order to complete that sentence. And a dependent clause, right, we say that it is not a complete thought. So a dependent clause is not a complete thought. And if we are going to look at an example, right, of both independent and dependent clauses, right? And before we even look at the example, once again, we see that independent clause, it is a complete thought. And when it is a complete thought, then it means that it has both subject and it has a predicate. And a independent clause, it can stand alone as a sentence. It can stand on its own as a sentence. So if you create sentences or make sentences or you write sentences, then if you just write a simple sentence with a subject and with a verb or a subject and a predicate, then that expresses already a complete thought. Whereas a dependent clause cannot stand on its own as a sentence and it does not express a complete thought. And to make it more easier, just think of when they say, oh, you are so independent or an independent person. Remember, an independent person does things on his or her own. That's a that's an independent person. So think of an independent clause that can stand on its own. You don't need another clause in order to complete that sentence because an independent clause already stands on its own and it shows a completed sentence. Whereas, let's say, for example, you as a child, right, you still need your parents. So we can say you are dependent on your parents. You are dependent on your parents for things, for clothes, for toiletries, for them to provide for you. So that is how a sentence is, a dependent clause is. A dependent clause cannot stand on its own. It cannot stand alone as a sentence. He needs another independent clause in order to complete that sentence. And if we look at examples, right? Then the first example says, let's pick up some sandwiches from Pete's Cafe. Let's pick up some sandwiches from Pete's Cafe. And if we look at that sentence, right? And then we can say that sentence is an independent clause because it has both subject and it has a predicate, and that sentence can stand alone and it already shows that it is a completed sentence. So it stands on its own and it is or it expresses a complete thought. So that is an independent clause or an independent sentence. And then we have another example that says, after Kevin gets off work. After Kevin gets off work. And if you look at that sentence, right, that is a dependent clause. And when we say it's a dependent clause, because if you say after Kevin gets off work, now the question is what's going to happen after he gets from work? So which means that there is no predicate. And it does not express a complete thought. So that is examples of an independent clause and a dependent clause. And remember, an independent clause can stand on its own because it shows a complete thought. It has both subject and it has a predicate. Whereas a dependent clause cannot stand on its own. It does not express a complete thought. It's either missing a subject or it is missing a predicate. And then we have a complex sentence. And a complex sentence, yeah, we can say it's made up of an independent clause and a dependent clause. That's a complex sentence. It has both independent and a dependent clause. Independent clause that can stand on its own with subject and a verb, whereas and a dependent clause that cannot stand on its own. It needs that independent clause in order to show the complete thought. And the dependent clause within the complex sentence, it usually begins with a subordinating conjunction, either using words like after, although, as, because, before, if, since, unless, until, when, or while. The example of a complex sentence. It says, let's pick up some sandwiches from Pete's Cafe after Kevin gets off work. So if you look at that sentence, right, this is now a complex sentence. This shows a complete sentence now. But it has both. Here is our independent clause that says, let's pick up some sandwiches from Pete's Cafe. That's an independent clause. And then it says, after Kevin gets off work, that is our dependent clause. And it also starts with the subordinating conjunction after. Right? So now we're going to find out what is a simple sentence, a compound sentence, and here we already went over what a complex sentence is. And a simple sentence, it is made up of one independent clause. And remember, we said an independent clause can stand on its own because it expresses a complete thought. So a simple sentence, it is made up of a single independent clause, one independent clause. And if we look at an example, it says, Ben and I spent all day relaxing by the pool. So Ben and I spent all day relaxing by the pool. And also when it comes to our simple sentences, right? Some simple sentences have introductory phrases also. And introductory phrases, right, is usually part of the predicate. For example, in the winter, Ben usually wears his heavy coat. So in the winter, Ben usually wears his heavy coat. So which means that Ben usually wears his heavy coat in the winter. That is actually what it means. And then we have a compound sentence. And a compound sentence is it's made up of two independent clauses. Once again, an independent clause can stand on its own. So a compound sentence, it is made up of two independent clauses that is joined by a coordinating conjunction. And coordinating conjunctions are words like and, but, or, so. That is basically our coordinating conjunction. It is made up of and, but, or, and so. So a compound sentence, it is made up of two independent clauses, and it is joined by a conjunction, coordinating conjunction, such as and, but, or, so. And if we look at an example of a complex sentence, or a compound sentence, it says, we saw a flash of lightning, and seconds later we heard the rumble of thunder. So we saw a flash of lightning, and seconds later we heard the rumble of thunder. So here we have one independent clause, and here we have another. And it is joined by a coordinating conjunction, which is and. And then once again, we said a complex sentence is made up of an independent clause as well as a dependent clause. And the dependent clause, it usually starts with a subordinating conjunction, right? So now we're going to a+students.ca, and then we're going to our test. And we're going to identify dependent and independent clauses. And remember, we said a dependent clause expresses a complete thought and can stand on its own. It has both subject and it has a predicate, whereas a dependent clause cannot stand on its own, right? It's either missing a subject or a predicate. And here we have an example, not even an example. We are now going to select the dependent clause within the sentence. The dependent clause within the sentence. And remember, we said a dependent clause usually starts with a subordinating conjunction. No problem. It says Kendrick revised the notes for his presentation while he rode the train to work. What is our dependent clause within that sentence? Kendrick advised revised the notes for his presentation while he rode the train to work. And if we were to identify our dependent clause within that sentence, right? And then we can say it is while he rode the train to work. There, while, it starts with a subordinating conjunction. While. The next one says we need to select the dependent clause within the sentence. It says before Lamar became the quarterback, he was a wide receiver on the football team. We need to select the dependent clause within that sentence. The dependent clause. And if we were to identify the dependent clause within that sentence, it is before Lamar became the quarterback. And there before it starts with the subordinating conjunction. Before Lamar became the quarterback. The next one says, before we move before we moved to our new apartment, my sister and I shared a room. What is our dependent clause within that sentence? Dependent clause. Remember, dependent clause cannot stand on its own. Starts with a subordinating conjunction. And if we identify our dependent clause within that sentence, right? And remember, it starts with a subordinating conjunction. And then we can say it is before we move to our new apartment. My sister and I shared a room. So well done. So now we're going to identify dependent and independent clauses within our test, right? We need to select the independent clause. And remember, an independent clause has a subject and a verb, can stand on its own body. It says, around, although Tess had been running late all day, she still made it to the meeting on time. What is our independent clause? Is it option one, although Tess had been running late all day? Or option two, she still made it to the meeting on time? Our independent clause, independent. So option one, although Tess had been running late all day, or option two, she still made it to the meeting on time. Independent clause. And if we were to select our dependent clause within that sentence, right? It says, although Tess had been running late all day, she still made it to the meeting on time. Option one or option two. All right, so someone's saying option one. Let's say option one. Even though the word although starts with a, you see, look at the word although, right? Although starts with a subordinating conjunction, right? Which means that that is a dependent clause. So she still made it to the meeting on time is the independent clause, right? I specifically chose that one also just to give you this example. Although is a subordinating conjunction, and remember we said a dependent clause starts with a subordinating conjunction. It's words like although, while, if, before, and so on. So next time, look at that word, like although, like look at the subordinating conjunction. See how the sentence starts, right? If the sentence starts with a subordinating conjunction, then you must know dependent clause, right? So option two is correct. We need to select the independent clause. Independent clause. After mom got a new job at the hospital, my older brother made our dinners for us. Look at that word after. Is it option one, after mom got a new job at the hospital, or option two, my older brother made our dinners for us? We need to select the independent clause. The independent clause. Remember, after is a subordinating conjunction. So, what is our correct sentence? Option one or option two? An independent clause, the independent clause that can stand on its own. independent. Remember, after starts with a subordinating conjunction. Dependent clauses starts with a subordinating conjunction. So look at the sentence again. We need to select the independent clauses. And it says once again, look at the first word after. Remember, after is a subordinating conjunction, and we said that a dependent clause starts with a subordinating conjunction. So which means that if we were to select the independent clause, right, we will choose option 2. Option 1 is a dependent clause because it starts with a subordinating conjunction. So our correct answer was option 2, right? Now, we need to select the dependent clause. That is why I'm saying look at the first word. The first word, if it starts with a subordinating conjunction, then it is a dependent clause, right? Here it says Brittany had never heard Farsi spoken until an Iranian family moved into her neighborhood. We need to select the dependent clause. Remember, a dependent clause cannot stand on its own, right? And it starts with a subordinating conjunction. So now we need to select the dependent clause. Is it option 1, Brittany had never heard Farsi spoken, or option 2, until an Iranian family moved into her neighborhood? Look at how the sentence starts. Option 1 or option 2, the dependent clause. All right, and if we were to select our dependent clause, right, within that sentence, then we can say option 2, until an Iranian family moved into her neighborhood. Until, right? Oopsie. We need to select the dependent clause. Before we moved to our new apartment, my sister and I shared a room. The dependent clause. Is it option one, before we moved to our new apartment, or option two, my sister and I shared a room? Which one is correct? Option one or option two? The dependent clause cannot stand on its own. Dependent clause. And if we were to select the dependent clause within that sentence, right? And then we can say our dependent clause is before we move to our new apartment. All right. So now we're going to say, is a sentence simple? Is it compound or complex, right? We said a simple sentence, right, has both it can stand on its own, and it has one independent clause. It has both subject and a verb. Whereas a compound sentence, it is made up of two independent clauses joined by a coordinating conjunction, such as and, but, or so. And then a complex sentence, it is made up of independent and a dependent clause. And our dependent clause, it begins with a subordinating conjunction, such as after, although, as, because, before, if, since, unless, until, when, or while. All right, so now we're going to select the simple, compound, or complex sentences. We need to say which one is a simple sentence. It has one independent clause only. It says option one, although it snowed all weekend, there was still not enough snow for skiing. Or option two, freedom of speech and trial by jury are two important rights in the United States Constitution. We need to identify our simple sentence, a simple sentence. And if we were to identify our simple sentence within that sentence, and then we can say it is option two. Freedom of speech and trial by jury are two important rights in the United States Constitution, which is a simple sentence within the sentences. Option one, sorry. In 1900, the US state with the largest population was New York. Or option two, while Shireen was interviewing the government, she uncovered plenty of information for her article. We need to say which one is a simple sentence. A simple sentence within. Is it option one Or is it option two, a simple sentence? And if we were to select our simple sentence, right? And then we can say our simple sentence is in 1900, the US state with the largest population was New York. All right, the last one. We need to select a complex sentence. And remember, a complex sentence has both independent clause and a subordinating, a dependent clause, right? And a dependent clause starts with a subordinating conjunction. It says the usual contraption had two levers, three ramps, and one metal basket. Or do we say option two, in the early morning? I drank tea by a spice stall as the Turkish bazaar came to life. So the unusual contraption had two levers, three ramps, and one metal basket. Or option two, in the early morning, I drank tea by a spice stall as the Turkish bazaar came to life. Which one is a complex sentence that has both independent clause as well as a dependent clause? And if we were to select our complex sentence, then we would say it is option two, in the early morning. I drank tea by a spice stall as a Turkish bazaar came to life. So, this is now the end of our lesson on simple, compound, and complex sentences. We said a simple sentence, it has a independent clause, only one single independent clause. It has a subject and a verb and it can stand on its own. Then we have a compound sentence that is made up of two independent clauses that is joined by a coordinating conjunction. And coordinating conjunctions are and, but, or, and so. And then we have a complex sentence, right, which is made up of an independent clause as well as a dependent clause. And a dependent clause starts with a subordinating conjunction. All right, and remember, an independent clause can stand on its own, whereas a dependent clause cannot stand on its own and doesn't express a complete thought. All right, so this is the end of our lesson, grade 6. Thank you very much for joining the class, and I really hope that you're going to have a good day further. So, till next time, goodbye.